All right. So, hello, Paul, and hi, Sean. So good of you to be with us. I'd like to talk to you about your wonderful composition, The Lord's Wonders at the Exodus. And we'll start with the question, what inspired you to compose this work and why this particular psalm?
Well, I'm pretty sure I found the tune. It was a period of time when Sean and I were working together. I was directing a community youth chorus in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and at that time he was my accompanist. And we had this kind of, I don't know, we were just young and curious. And so we explored a lot of things. And often I would just bring stuff into rehearsal and teach it to the kids. And then Sean would sit at the piano and make up something.
Huh.
And a lot of what we did, some of it worked out really well, and I think a lot of it didn't. A lot of it went on the musical scrap heap, never to be seen or heard from again. But this piece, it kind of did work. I'm remembering it was in the 90s, and there was this period of time in the 90s when chant became like the rage. Everyone was recording chants and everyone was listening to chants and, like it was new. And of course it wasn't. It was the opposite of new, but it was this sort of chant renaissance period. And so we did a lot of chants during that time. And I found as the vocal teacher, and I mean, they were children. So I was actually using the melodic material to teach the rudiments of singing. And I found that chant worked beautifully for all kinds of musical reasons. It's unison, and you could shape phrases, and you could focus on vowel formation and these kinds of things. So this was one of the chants that we played with during that time. And Sean sat at the piano and came up with what he comes up with, which always I'm going like, dude, how do you think of this stuff? Sean, did you have was there any particular genesis for the accompaniment that you remember?
I was thinking about that today because it's been a long time since I thought about that piece, like in detail. And I actually put it on today and I listened to it again. And I do remember that at the time I was listening to, one of the things that was in my ear was Grand Pianola Music by John Adams, which is this big symphonic work for two pianos and full orchestra, which is it's like arpeggios zooming up and down the keyboard. And, it was sort of pseudo minimalist music. So a lot of repeating patterns and a lot of sort of hypertonal, like staying very stable in a couple of keys. And I know that I was listening to a lot of that back then, and just that was coming out. And because chant, I think it lends itself to that sort of, I don't know, simple harmonic progressions, but the motion of arpeggios or repeated rhythmic patterns that was just in my ear at the time. Yeah, it was always improvised. Like I didn't write it down until my wife had to play it.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I remember that.
yeah.
An interesting thing about this process, so Sean and I were in rehearsals together 2 or 3 days a week, and this process of just sort of creating stuff on the fly became part and parcel of who we were. It's what we did, but we didn't really think that we were composers or arrangers or that anyone would ever listen to it or care. And so that's kind of interesting. The other thing that's interesting is this. So Sean and I have become, like, our lives are intertwined inextricably, and we have really become like brothers. And 30 years later, I have never heard this John Adams story that he just told us. Like,
well, and it's interesting.
He never mentioned it.
Because I don't think I was ever really conscious of it. Like, this comes from that. Like, no, I never thought in those terms. It was just what was coming out of my fingers at the time. I can't explain it any other way.
So now this is a story of how young and dumb we were, Josh. And I think that you will connect to this part at the end of the story. I'm not for sure, but I think you will. So Sean and I had done this piece with our chorus in Grand Rapids, and then we went and did like a summer vocal camp with kids in Princeton, New Jersey. And of course, we just took whatever we had done the previous year at home, because we were really there to have a good time, not to, create a whole new repertoire and et cetera.
Go to New York.
So we wanted to go to New York. So we did this piece there on one of the concerts. And then I got back to Grand Rapids at some time in the fall, and I had a message that someone had called me, and they said that it's the mother of Allison Miller, and I knew that she was a kid at the camp. She had been there. So I returned the call, and she says, so this piece that you did, that was a very nice piece, and I was wondering if you could send me the music to it. And I said, this is the part that's just, we were so young. And oh no, we don't give our music away. We just do what we want to do. We don't just give our music away. And the woman on the other end of the line said, oh, well, that's very sad. I wanted to conduct it at the National Conference of the American Choral Directors Association this spring. And I went, who are you? It was Judith Willoughby. And I didn't know her then. And Judith and I became very close, and I consider her one of my two principal musical mentors at this point in my life. But at the time, she was just calling me on the phone and asking for this song, and I'm like, and then she said that, and I went, what are you talking about? And so then she and I talked, and I told her that it wasn't written down, which was always a problem with anything Sean and I were doing. It wasn't written down. The first things we had published with Earth Songs wanted to publish it, and I'm like, well, it's not written down. And I remember Ron Jeffers said, well, if I mail you a pad of staff paper, do you think you could write it down? And I went, well, I guess we could. Anyway, so it wasn't written, it wasn't notated at all. And Judith said that if I would send her a recording, she would notate it. And I think I mailed a cassette tape from Michigan to Pennsylvania, and she did. And my guess is that is where you, Joshua, heard the piece performed in obviously not the first time you'd heard the tune, but my guess is that that's where you heard it. Sean subsequently wasn't crazy about the notation because it was not minimalist at all. It was very metered. And so Sean went back and redid it when his wife had to play it subsequently, and with no bar lines and much more sort of, So anytime I do the piece since then, I give the accompanist Sean's sparse version and an MP3 of Sean playing it. It seems to work. I think that's probably why we never got it published, because it just seemed like too hard to explain. Like, okay, you need to look at this sketch and you need to listen to this recording, and it's just too many barriers if you're not actually talking to the performer.
Which is too bad. I wish it were published, because it is such a great piece. Let me throw out a couple of more questions still about this. One is, it's the Tonus Peregrinus, as you know, and were you aware that it had a brother or a sister in the Jewish tradition that is almost identical, using the same psalm but with the Hebrew text? And then the other question is, when did you add the soprano saxophone and the percussion parts?
I think I became aware. I think that when we first started doing it, I was not aware that it was that old and that it had come really pretty literally straight out of Hebraic chant. I was aware that that this was a thing in music history that had happened to some degree or another. But I think and remember, it's 30 years ago, and I'm not for sure, but I think when we first started doing it, I think I probably referred to the Lieber and subsequently became aware. I'm not altogether sure. It may have even been you, Josh, that made me aware. I'm not sure. It was so long ago. So the percussion came because I had bought these beautiful goat bells from India that hung in my house, and they had the most gorgeous sound, and I still have them. And anytime that I do this piece, I grab those bells because they're just, it was luck. The reason we put the bells in is because I had them. And I bought them in Grand Rapids at that store right across from the Kava House, Sean. Spirit Dreams. And so I had them and I used them.
Which is still there, by the way.
Yeah. And so we had this friend who was a regular collaborator. I mean, that's another story. One day this kid came up after rehearsal and said, well, if you ever need a sax player, my dad plays the saxophone. And I thought, oh, you're right. You know, well, it turns out like later I really did need a real saxophone player. And he was who I was referred to by someone from the symphony. And he is an incredible artist. And he ended up basically being on stage with me every time that he was available for probably the next 15 or 20 years until I moved to Seattle. I was still using Ed. If Ed was available, Ed was on my gig because he could add saxophone to anything and make it elegant, you know?
Yep.
The inspiration for wanting to add saxophone to this piece, though, it came from that recording by Jan Garbarek called Officium. Sean and I were obsessed with that recording. I bought a ridiculously expensive stereo system because Sean and I went to the store and listened to that CD on those speakers, and I said, sold. Had that stereo system until maybe a year and a half or 2 years ago. But that Jan Garbarek caused us to fall in love with soprano saxophone, and he was on that recording. He was improvising on top of polyphony. So I guess we fancied ourselves, you know, Jan Juniors. I don't know.
John, you want to add anything to that?
No, that explains it. I mean, Ed, the guy that we hired to be part of the performances and recordings, was playing with us a lot at a certain point in our collaboration in Grand Rapids. And gigs with him were always just much more fun because of what he added creatively. He was he had such a great ear for what was needed in a particular place, and still is just a very fine person and musician. It was really a pleasure working with him.
Is he a person who plays both jazz and classical?
Yeah. He subs in the symphony. He plays flute in the symphony when needed, our Grand Rapids Symphony. And he used to have a group called the Clifford Music Group, which would be he just hired musicians for whatever anybody needed. And I got to be part of a few of those gigs, and it was just really fun.
That the music was always better if he was on the stage. Like Absolutely. I feel about Sean. Like if Sean is on the stage, everything goes better.
And Paul. I feel the same way about Paul.
That I don't know about. But.
That's true.
So I've conducted a number of your other arrangements with my chorus at Northeastern University, and this seems to be quite different from at least the published ones that I have done. Can you talk about that, and do you see a difference between your approach to secular pieces and sacred, or this piece and your other very dynamic compositions and arrangements?
Paul. Yeah, it is. Lord's Wonders is pretty different from much of the other stuff that we have done. We've done a lot of gospel influenced, spiritual influenced pieces. And of course, these are pieces that could be, readily written down and then interpreted by other choirs. So that's also part of this. There's a whole trough of things that Paul and I used to do with the kids back in the 90s that no one will ever see because there's nothing to see. So I guess that would be one of the chief differences. But like Paul said, I mean, we were heavily influenced by that Jan Garbarek recording with the Hilliard Ensemble, and we really just wanted to recreate that kind of atmosphere with children so that they could experience what it was like to be part of that kind of collaboration. I think one of the reasons we started doing music on our own, writing stuff for kids, was we weren't finding things that really lit our fires in the store. There's a whole lot more really good stuff available today, but I think back then it seemed like a little bit of a wasteland when it came to children's chorus literature, and we wanted to give them something that was more substantial, things that told a story that we thought it was important for the kids to know about. I think that's one of the big reasons we started doing that. So I'll pass it over to Paul.
Well, the thing that I remember that I think is still true is Sean and I had or have a passionate love affair with roots music, American roots music and music of the world that is old. What happened is that a couple of concert arrangements of American roots music that had their genesis in gospel music or religious traditions in America, those were published first, and that's what we became known for. And then when, we didn't think we were even legit. Like, what, you want to do what? You want to do our song? Like, we really, honestly. Oh, and the other thing, okay, when Judith performed that at National ACDA, we were so young and innocent. It honestly never occurred to either of us that we should attend. We didn't. We didn't know that it was a big thing. We really didn't. But anyway, because Go Where I Send Thee, John the Revelator, Ain't No Grave, because those things got published and did really well with American choirs, that's what we were known for. And when people came to us for commissions, what they wanted was a closer, No one was asking us for a chant setting. So we had all this stuff that we were, had in our back pocket and were playing with, but no one really cared except us. And, occasionally Judith or you or someone else would ask for one of these other things, but for the most part, no. And I remember it, at some point in time, I guess we had been sort of well-known choral writers for maybe a decade, and Robin Lana came to us for a commission in Cincinnati. And at that time, I was really enamored with the story. It was an incredible story of a young girl who had escaped genocide in Rwanda. And I said to Robin, I really want to write about this, but I guess you want a closer. And she said, no, I don't need a closer, write what you want. And so we wrote Beneath the African Skies, which is still one of my favorite things that we've done. But it has been difficult to, we became known as the guys that would write your choir a standing ovation, okay? And
there are worse reputations to have.
And we did it, and we did it, and we did it, and we did it. But it was hard to, some people would say break out of that. But what Sean and I know was that from the very beginning, it was a part of who we were and what we were doing. But at the same time that we were doing Go Where I Send Thee, we were doing The Lord's Wonders at the Exodus and a gazillion other kinds of things that were different.
I would just add to that and say, I think we were doing far more of the contemplative or meditative or deep stuff together with our choirs than we were doing, gospel arrangements. That was by far more of our cup of tea, I guess.
and that is around. It started with the experience of our arrangement of Ani Maamin. I sent it to you after it was kind of complete because I was proud of it, because I thought it turned out really well. And you responded pretty promptly with, has this gone to press yet? And I said, no. And you said, good, because there are some problems. And I think some things I had said in either the program notes or the narration wasn't quite right. And there was also, and because I had a copy that I had found of just the song at Temple Sinai in Chicago when I was working there. And you said to me, you can either do this in modern Hebrew or you can do it the way it was done in the shtetl, but you can't flip back and forth. You got to choose.
Right.
And I said, well, you choose, because I'm really not qualified to make this, and you said it's really just but anyway, you fixed these problems. And subsequent to that, you have remained over the years so generous with us and with other people regarding your scholarship around Jewish music. And I've seen that, I've experienced it, I've been the beneficiary of it. And I just want your audience to know that this world of choral music is a much better, richer, and more informed place because you were always the person, and are still the person we can go to and say, well, this is what I did, would you vet it and correct it? Or this is what I'm thinking about, is there any problem with this? And it really has just made everything better. I'm remembering a few years ago that I knew someone who for her doctoral project, she wanted to create a new performing edition of a Schoenberg piece. And she was having issues with the Hebrew scholarship. And she herself spoke Hebrew because she had lived in Israel, but she knew that she needed academic stuff. And I said to her, you should talk to Joshua Jacobson. And she said, oh, I've never met him. And I'm like, well, I'll introduce you. Like, Joshua will be all over this. The last thing in the world he wants is for a new performing edition of a major piece in Hebrew to be released with errors. Like,
I was wondering what would be the end of that sentence.
yeah, like he wants it to be correct, like, and you helped her. And anyway, I wanted to thank you for that. And I wanted your audience to know how far your reach extends beyond what they see and hear.
Well, that's very generous of you. Thank you. Thank you, Paul.
True. Yeah.
I don't have many more questions. I don't know if you've, one thing I was going to ask is, how have audiences reacted to this piece when you have programmed it, or when other choirs have done it? Do you have any experience with that?
I've done it since we did it together. When Paul moved away, I kept that piece in the repertoire, and when I had a choir that I directed, my wife Leah was able to play the accompaniment very convincingly, and so I've done it a few times, and I think the kids always wind up loving it. I think because part of it is they get to sit with it for a long time and get used to the sounds. I think it's one of those pieces it's probably a good idea to hear a couple of times so you can kind of see what's going on with it. I think sometimes it might hit an audience like, what did I just hear? Because it's different. It's nothing like a typical 4/4 piece of music with a boom chick accompaniment. But I think it's, at least in my experience, it's been very well liked. And like I said, the kids really get into the free chant style of it.
The other thing that I'm remembering is that we were performing a lot of times at a couple of really old-timey churches in Grand Rapids that were cathedral acoustic.
Yeah.
And wow, like you can rehearse this for weeks and the chorus can be going, yawn, And then you put it in that space and you add the saxophone. And because of the acoustic, the piano accompaniment is really not clean at all,
Right.
nor is it supposed to be.
All
And
weaves.
suddenly, so it's one of those, you know, it's like an environmental piece. It is transformed in the moment.
Yeah.
And I think that's when the performers love it.
Yeah.
And I think audiences enjoy that experience as well.
The recording that we're using, we have a video from a performance we did in 2001 at a big Catholic church cathedral in Newton, Massachusetts. So it's very much what you're saying, and we had that beautiful acoustic, and we found that it's been received very well by the audiences. And we had a great saxophonist also, Ken Rednowski, who also plays with the Boston Symphony,
Awesome.
was with us.
I don't know if you're aware, but it is on you, like the recording that Paul and I did with Ed Clifford and our kids way back in 1990. Help me out. Whatever. That's on YouTube. You can find that if you search The Lord's Wonders and then one of our names, that'll pop up. It's just the album cover, but the music is there. So if anybody was curious about what it sounded like back then when we created it, that's kind of almost the original.
Yeah, it probably was almost
Yeah.
as close to the original as you could get, because everything would have a lot of iterations. Like we would do it, and then we would tinker with it, and then we would do it again and tinker with it more, and then we'd bring in Ed. You know,
Which
one thing I do have to say is I am the only one who's ever been to perform it with those goat bells, and those goat bells are beautiful.
Oh, and the goat bells are in the YouTube recording I'm talking about. So you could definitely hear Paul's goat bells.
All right, this one. Anything else you guys would like to add about the piece or about working together, your careers, life?
I'll just say working with Paul and it has been the highlight of my life and career so far. Doing it live with him in Grand Rapids, and then when he moved away, we were so fortunate to be able to work together on I don't know how many other pieces together, a lot. And I go back to those pieces and just remember what it was like to do that. It's to me, it seems like a pretty unique partnership. I'm not really aware of anybody else who does it like that.
How did you manage to collaborate after Paul moved away?
Well, the funny thing about that is when I moved away, we had a commission waiting, and it was like we had to deliver a score to another choir. So this business about us just getting in rehearsal and, you know, that we had to deliver measure one and measure. And so at that time, we were using pencil and paper and staff paper. And I distinctly remember that we spent more on FedEx shipping the score back and forth to each other than we made on that measly little commission project, because I think it was our first commission. We didn't charge hardly anything. Anyway, at the end of that, I remember it was probably Sean, because he's always been more computer oriented than me. He said, you know, we have to get Finale, because then we can email this back and forth. And we did, and we learned it. And we got pretty good at it. Yeah. It was this partnership has really defined, I think, both of our careers as a musician, and largely defined like who we are as people. I miss him.
I miss you too.
Yeah.
Do you ever get to see each other? Do you ever visit?
He came to my wedding like 3 years ago, and I think that this is the first time we've actually seen each other. I mean, we're pretty regular on the phone with texting and all that, but I think this is the first time we've actually seen each other's face.
That's
since
right.
my wedding. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad I could bring you together.
I'm really glad you did.
Anything else you'd like to add, guys? I know we've kept you for quite a while already.
We're good.
Right.
Thank you so much for doing it.
All right.
That's great.
It's wonderful to see you both.
Likewise.